Last time we covered the beginnings of the religion of Islam. We were doing a historical overview of the Islamic empires. And we covered the beginning of religion through the life of Muhammad. We got into the period of the Rashidun Caliphate, the rightly guided caliphs, and looked at those four individuals, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. And when we finished up, we were at the death of Ali. And at that period in time, we see a fragmentation of the Ummah. We have a division or a split between Sunni and Shia Islam. That split lasts through even to this day. And we are about to go into the period known as the Umayyad Caliphate, the Umayyad dynasty, the Umayyad Empire, with the ascension of Muawiyah. So we're going to turn our attention to that period, and we're going to trace it through to the golden age of Islam, and then I think we're going to even take it all the way through to the 20th century with the Ottoman Empire and to its final collapse in the early period of the 20th century, right after World War I. So why don't we turn our attention, take a look at Islamic history now from 661, the death of Ali, up through about 1924. The Umayyad Empire, or the Umayyad dynasty, 661 to 750. This is Ali's successor, Hassan. Not that he's not Umayyad, but again, it's going to start with this idea of Ali's succession with Hassan. Hassan holds the caliphate temporarily. Muawiyah, back in Syria, decides he's going to march against him. Now, Hassan didn't want a conflict, and because of this, he actually loses some support. He's a little too weak in dealing with Muawiyah. He actually tries to negotiate after several inconclusive battles. Ultimately, Hassan abdicates. He cedes the caliphate to Muawiyah in order to avoid a civil war. Right? Signs a treaty with the guy and then retires to Medina, where he, not long afterward, is actually poisoned by his wife, Jada, who is probably paid off to do it by Muawiyah. So there's Ali's son eliminated. So the caliphate really is now in the hands of Muawiyah. He's going to be the caliph from 661 to 680. Sorry, I should have brought that text up a little bit earlier. And he's going to found what's known as the Umayyad dynasty. And the capital of this dynasty is going to be in Damascus. This is where he was governing. This is his center of power. So Damascus, Syria, becomes the political and the religious center really now. Definitely the political center. Maybe I should say that Mecca and Medina are still the spiritual centers, but still, power is in Damascus. As far as the Umayyad territorial expansion, there's quite a bit. They cover North Africa from Tunisia to Tunisia, and then Kabul in Afghanistan to the east by 670. They've got that. The island of Rhodes, 672. They actually march on the capital of Constantinople and besiege it in 677. This is something we covered before as well. Constantine IV and the use of Greek fire. He basically defeats them, stopping the advance of Islam, at least temporarily, from moving into Europe at this time period. Okay, so that's a pretty important moment for the Roman Empire. Anyways, that photo that you see there is the art showing the use of Greek fire against the Umayyad armies, Umayyad fleet. Anyways, Umayyad succession. After Muawiyah, actually after Hassan, we have the rise of Hussein, the other son of Ali, the grandson of Muhammad. He actually tries to take the caliphate back into the family in 679. He had support in Iraq at Kufa. He wants to take it back from Muawiyah. You do have a battle in 680 called the Battle of Karbala. It was done on the month of Muharram, which is on the 10th of the month. This is known as the Passion of Hussein. This is you shouldn't even really call it a battle so much as a slaughter. It was really way outnumbered. Hussein only had maybe 70 or 80 men with him, and the Umayyad army basically ambushes him, and this is an army that was at least 5,000 strong. So it was really a slaughter. Hussein and his family are ultimately wiped out by the son of Muawiyah, the successor of Muawiyah, a guy by the name of Yazid. Okay, he's going to be the next caliph. And this idea of the 10th of Muharram, the Passion of Hussein, becomes a moment of martyrdom in the Shia tradition. This is a very important sacred holiday in the Shia tradition. Anyways, Yazid, 680 to 683, succeeds his father Muawiyah as next caliph in Damascus, and he's going to introduce, again, hereditary rule. So it's not going to be caliph selected by committee, except for on certain occasions. It's going to be passed down like a kingship would, like the imperial throne in the Roman Empire was. Okay, he actually defeats, like I said, the Battle of Karbala, the Shia. Hussein is beheaded, by the way, and then he founds this dynasty. Anyway, so What follows is the next fitna, the next civil war, not long after. So the Umayyad time was not necessarily a time of complete unity. You do have some really important moments. Ibn al-Zubair, 683 to 685. He was a grandson of Abu Bakr. He was governor in the Holy City, which would have been Mecca. Now, he was an advocate of Shura, right? The election committee. He was opposed to this idea of succession, and ultimately he rallied opposition to the Umayyads in the Holy City. He actually goes ahead and declares himself caliph in opposition to the Umayyads in Syria. And then he gets Egypt and Iraq to basically support him. Okay, and this, of course, is going to spark a civil war, as you would imagine. Now, Yazid's forces end up besieging Mecca. Okay, according to al-Tabari, they end up besieging the city, and while the city is under siege, Ibn Zubair, for some reason, destroys the Kaaba. Saves the Black Stone, but he destroys the sacred Kaaba. Not long after this, the Umayyad forces are forced to withdraw, not because of military obstacle, but they were withdraw back to Damascus because Yazid dies. Okay, they get word that Yazid had passed away. His son succeeds him in the meantime. This is a guy by the name of Muawiyah II, who happens to be a boy. He's a teenager, and he doesn't last for very long. He actually dies within about 2 months of taking the throne. But in the meantime, the siege of the city is relieved, and Ibn Zubair then rebuilds the Kaaba. And he, by the way, is going to be the first person to actually put the name Muhammad on a coin. What he's trying to do seems to be unifying the empire, right? He's trying to present himself as a successor to Muhammad in a legitimate way. So he's going to want to take advantage of the prophet's name. He needs a foundation if he's going to, become the new caliph. Ultimately, this is not going to work out well for Ibn Zubair. Marwan ends up becoming the next caliph. 684 to 685, again, very short, brief stint as Umayyad leader. He's the one that's supposedly the one that destroys, by the way, the Quran of Hafsa that I mentioned before. But he's elected as caliph, and he passes the throne to his son, Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan. And Abd al-Malik, very important figure, 685 to 705, ultimately is going to defeat Ibn Zubair, 692. His troops go down, and under his commander Ibn Yusuf, he besieged Mecca for about a 6-month period. Ibn Zubair is killed, and it's effectively the end of the second fitna and a reunification of the empire. And then afterward, Abd al-Malik goes ahead and unifies Islam again with the building of a building in Jerusalem, which is known as the Dome of the Rock. This is again another statement, kind of the way that Ibn Zubair put Muhammad's name on a coin. Abd al-Malik is going to be the first one to actually put Muhammad's name on a building. Okay, the Dome of the Rock, which you see in the background of this photo, was on the spot that once stood the Jewish temple. Right, this is on the Temple Mound, long gone, destroyed by the Romans in 70 A.D. But now you've got this Dome of the Rock right there. And the dome on the top of it, by the way, is it matches the dimensions of the most important Christian building in the city of Jerusalem, which was the tomb, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Okay, so this is going to become the third holiest site and a site of pilgrimage as well for the Islamic world. And it's supposedly also the place that Muhammad ascended into heaven in what's known as the Miraj, the night journey, where he's kind of spiritually taken from Medina, flies to Jerusalem, and then ascends to heaven, according to Surah 17. Anyways, the Umayyad peak and decline is going to follow. So al-Walid, 705 to 715, was the son of Abd al-Malik, does an invasion. This is the time of the invasion and conquest of Europe. Invasion of Visigothic Iberia, 711. And it was the year that the Muslim armies arrive in Spain, and by 716, they've effectively conquered the majority of the peninsula. This was under the command of Tariq ibn Ziyad. As a matter of fact, the word Gibraltar, which you're probably familiar with, the Rock of Gibraltar, is based on the Arabic word Jabal al-Tariq, meaning the mountain of Tariq. So this is named after this guy. There's also the general by the name of Musa, so you got the couple guys that are really important. But the conquest of Spain takes place. The Visigoths are ousted. In 712, Muhammad ibn Qasim conquers the Punjab region in the other direction, Pakistan. Okay, as far as building programs, the Masjid al-Nawabi in Medina is built, and the great mosque of Damascus, which is the fourth holiest site in Islam, is constructed over the top of what was once the Cathedral of St. John. Okay, so there's a couple of big building programs. On the screen, you could actually see the Great Mosque of Damascus. You can almost see kind of the reminiscent shape of the earlier Cathedral of St. John underneath. Anyway, Suleiman, 715 to 717, as the brother of Walid, he is going to lead a big siege on Constantinople in 717. This is the one we talked about with Emperor Leo III actually fighting it off and again saving Constantinople from Arabic invasion. And ultimately it ends the Umayyad hope of taking the Roman Empire. They basically give up that idea. The Roman Empire is going to remain in place. During the time of Hisham, the next caliph, not the direct next one, but very soon after, from 724 to 743, was the final son of al-Malik to become caliph. He effectively ends expansion. He says a couple big setbacks during his reign. In 732, you've got the defeat of the armies in Spain, actually, who have now invaded the Frankish territory. Right at the Battle of Tours, Charles Martel defeats the Arab armies at Tours, or between Poitiers and Tours. And then in 739, you have a major Berber revolt that breaks out in North Africa, which ultimately is going to have the territory that's later Morocco separated from the caliphate. It never really regains unity with the caliphate at all. Okay, so it's kind of nearing the end now of the Umayyad period, some major setbacks, some loss of territory, and the decline follows very quickly. Okay, Marwan II, he's the last of the Umayyad leaders from Syria, 744 to 750. And in 750, there's what's known as the Battle of Zab. The Umayyads face off against the people that are really going to take them out, a group known as the Abbasids. Now, the Abbasids trace themselves back to one of the uncles of Muhammad, and they were definitely enemies of the Umayyads. And what happens after this battle is the Abbasids not only defeat the Umayyads on the battlefield, but they ultimately wipe out the Umayyad clan almost entirely. Like 300 members of the family are hunted down and killed. Marwan himself flees to Egypt, but is caught and killed by 750, with the exception of one member of the family that we know escapes. The only survivor of the family is a guy by the name of Abdurrahman I, who makes his way across North Africa into Spain, or al-Andalus. And he is going to become the one who founds what's known as the Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba in 755. So even though the Umayyads lose power in the Near East, they maintain power in Europe. Okay, a very small Umayyad state. Okay, that's independent of Abbasid control, because everything now is going to shift to the Abbasids. Anyways, ultimately you're going to have another caliphate spring up in al-Andalus, the Caliphate of Cordoba, which is going to be established a little bit later by Abdurrahman III. All right, so what's going on back in the Abbasid world? The Abbasids, 750, the dates are a little bit confusing, 750 to 1058, or we could extend it all the way to 1258, depending on whether we're going to look at the caliph as political leader or merely spiritual leader. Right, so this is a family, like I said, traces itself back to Muhammad's uncle Abbas. And it was an anti-Umayyad revolution that they sparked, which is based on this idea of the non-Arab Muslims in the empire. Not all the Muslims are Arab, okay? The entire region of Persia, those are non-Arab peoples, okay? But you've got a lot of groups that are upset about the Umayyads, specifically because the Umayyads tended to keep power to themselves, right? Pass different positions to members of the family. And you have, of course, revolutionary, members of the Shia party over there in Iraq and Iran, etc. So you've got all these groups that are going to coalesce and support the Abbasid seizure of the caliphate. Now, not all the Shias support the caliphate because the Abbasid caliph happens to be Sunni, but nonetheless, they did give initial support to this movement. Now, the first important guy is going to be Abu Abbas al-Safa, who reigns from 750 to 754. He's the first Abbasid caliph. He is proclaimed caliph in Kufa. He's the one that defeated Marwan in the Battle of Zab. But he moves things away from Damascus. Okay, away from Damascus, he makes Kufa his initial capital, and later on, it's going to move to a brand new city known as Baghdad. Okay, Baghdad is going to be moved there by al-Mansur, and this is a brand new city, and it's going to also mark the golden age of Islam. Okay, the Abbasid Caliphate is this time of flourishing of Islamic culture. Baghdad becomes like a center of learning. It becomes a center of science. It becomes a center of art. Okay, so you've got a lot of stuff produced in the Golden Age. But even though it's a golden age culturally, it's kind of interesting that it wasn't necessarily politically a golden age. That's a totally different story. This is what the map looks like. There are numerous autonomous dynasties that broke off from Abbasid control. Okay, and most of them recognize the Abbasid Caliph as a spiritual head, if not a political leader, with certain exceptions, like the Umayyads in Spain are not going to look at him as a spiritual leader. The Almohads later in Morocco, the Fatimids in Egypt are later going to reject him. But a lot of these other territories do recognize at least the spiritual leadership of the Abbasid. But again, it's much more a complex picture. If I was going to give you a different map, you could see how many more territories are that empire was broken up into. As a matter of fact, in the dark green line in the center there in Iraq, you see the Abbasid territory, which is directly controlled by the Caliph. The light green that surrounds it are territories that had broken off under other dynasties, but still recognize the Caliph as spiritual leader. And then you've got the territories beyond that that are not in green at all, which don't look to the Caliph for either political or spiritual leadership. Okay? But you give a lot of these groups, the Idrisid dynasty in Morocco, the Aghlabid dynasty in Algeria and Tunisia. The most important, and I'm not going to go through all the different ones because there are tons of these things that spring up, dynasties popping up after other dynasties, dividing, succeeding, and conquering other dynasties. It goes over centuries, so it's a pretty complex picture. But ones that I might want to point out would be groups like the Fatimids in Cairo. Right? These are Shia, Ismaili, sect that dominates Cairo basically between 909 and 1171. That's going to be really important a little bit later on. Anyways, in the 10th and 11th centuries, you can start to see decline. The Abbasids lose control of most of Iraq to various emirs. An emir would basically be a lord, a military leader, a local ruler. Okay, so that happens in the 10th century. One of these emirs or groups is going to be the Buwahids, or the Buyids, named after Ali ibn Buya, 934 to 949. This is a Persian Shia faction that assumes control in Baghdad, at least over the government, over the bureaucracy. The Abbasids retain the court, but that's going to change. In the 11th century, the Buwahid dynasty starts to weaken a little bit, and you start to have a new group arrive on the scene. These are known as the Seljuks. These are Turks. The Seljuk Turks, or the Oghuz Turks, are these new converts from Central Asia, new converts to the religion that have moved into the region. And in 1055, Tughril Beg is going to really start to take control of the empire. In 1055, he's declared Sultan. Now, Sultan is basically ruler. Okay? Now, he was the grandson of the guy by the name of Seljuk. Now, he's commissioned initially by the Abbasid Caliph al-Qaim to free Baghdad from the Buwahids. So he marches on Baghdad. He's declared Sultan. He ousts the Buwahids, okay, and temporarily he's in charge. But within a few years, 1058, a new emir, Basasiri, who happened to be a former slave, but somebody that was in a position underneath the Buwahids, he served under the Buwahid leaders, rebels against the Seljuks and drives them out temporarily. What happens is the Caliph, al-Qaim, is exiled at that time. Now he goes to the Turks, and in 1058, between 1058 and 1060, the Seljuks come back, regain control of the Caliphate, install Qaim again as Caliph, and matter of fact, Tughril Beg ends up marrying the Caliph's daughter, kind of becoming part of the family. Now what happens here is the Abbasids are going to maintain the leadership as the head of the Ummah, the head of the community religiously. But the Seljuk Turks are going to be the political leaders. The sultans are going to rule in the Caliph's name. So now you really have a division between the politics and religion. Okay, not completely, but this is an important moment. Okay, now his successors, Tughril Beg's successors, Alp Arslan and Malik Shah, are going to move their leadership into Persia. So Baghdad isn't going to become a political center so much after this period the way it used to be. Anyways, let's talk about the Seljuks now in the Crusades, because they're going to be the big enemy when it comes to the early Crusades. We've talked about these in the past when we dealt with the Byzantine Empire. 1071, the Battle of Manzikert, is a defeat of the Byzantine army by Alp Arslan, the son of Tughril Beg, the leader of the Seljuk Turks at in Asia Minor. And this was, again, like I said, a very aggressive Islamic empire building by the Turks. He defeats the Roman army and deciphers a battle and ultimately takes over most of Anatolia at that point. By 1077, the Turks actually have seized control of Jerusalem from the Fatimids in Egypt. In 1092, you have the death of the Sultan at the time, Malik Shah. Okay, now this is what prompts the Byzantine Empire, Alexius I Komnenos, to figure he can retake the territory. The Islamic world, the Turkish world, was fragmented. You've got some civil war among the guys that remain, and Alexius sees this as an opportunity. So what he does is he ends up writing to the Pope in the West in order to get some military aid in order to reconquer these territories. And what happens, of course, is in 1095, the Pope, Urban II, declares a crusade. He calls a crusade at the Council of Clermont. Okay, not exactly what Alexius was expecting, but it's a mission to not only move into the territory of the former Roman Empire, but to capture the holy city of Jerusalem from Islam. That was the mission. And from 1097 to 1099, this takes place. About thousands of heavily armored Norman and French knights arrive in Constantinople. They're shipped across to Asia Minor. They end up taking a lot of territory in this 3-year process. In the meantime, the Turks lose control of Jerusalem. So by the time that the Crusaders arrive in Jerusalem, it was the Egyptian Fatimids that had already gained control of the city. They weren't necessarily the enemy that the war was declared against, but Syria and the Holy Land ultimately fall to the Crusaders by 1099. And what you have emerge is a series of states that are known as the Crusader states. And they're going to be in the land from about 1099 to 1291 for about 200 years. The county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, and most importantly, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Okay? So we've got this new cultural group. They're now present in the greater Islamic world. Now, what happens in the rest of this period of crusading? In the 12th century, the Seljuks begin to weaken, as most empires do. The Abbasids gain greater independence from their control. In 1187, Jerusalem is actually taken back from the Crusaders. Right? So even though the Crusader states are still there in some sense, Jerusalem itself is lost. And it's lost to one of the most famous warriors or generals of the medieval Islamic world, Salah al-Din, or Saladin, Yusuf ibn Ayyub, who founds the Ayyubid dynasty in Egypt. He defeats the Crusaders at a decisive battle at Hattin and then goes on to take the city back. And that sparks another crusade, the Third Crusade. Anyways, the 13th century, you have a Mongol invasion. The Mongols are kind of like the Turks before them. They're the people from the further, the Mongolian plain in Central Asia. And they're building an empire. This was begun by Genghis Khan. And they sweep into the Near East in this time period. And ultimately are going to bring the Seljuk Empire to an end. Okay, so it's the Mongols, not the Crusaders, that ultimately ending Seljuk domination. In 1258, the Abbasid rule effectively ends for at least a period of 3 years. Hulagu Khan, who is the grandson of Genghis, sacks Baghdad. That's why we say that the Abbasid Caliphate, at least as a religious institution, ends in 1258. Okay, but it's not necessarily the end, because in 1261, the Abbasid Caliph resumes leadership in Egypt under the Mamluks. This was what we call the Shadow Caliphate that I mentioned earlier. Okay, 1291, the Mamluks are the ones that finally drive out the Crusaders with the conquest of the last Crusader stronghold, the city of Acre. Okay, and this is a later painting of the siege of Acre by the Mamluks. Okay, that's the end of the Crusader states, and not necessarily the end of the Crusades. There are lots of other Crusades that follow, but the end of the major period of crusading, 1291. Okay, now we are going to move to the Ottoman Empire and then later the Caliphate. The Ottoman Empire, 1302 to 1924. This is going to bring us right up into the 20th century. It was also a caliphate, at least from 1517 to 1924. It was founded, the empire, by Osman Bey, or Uthman, as he's also known, who was sultan between 1258 and 1326, which is a pretty long reign. Actually, 1288 is when he reigned. His life was between 1258. He was the grandson of a guy by the name of Suleiman. He leads new groups of Turks into Anatolia, and he was known as a Ghazi. A Ghazi is a warrior. And he situates his stronghold right across from Constantinople. And he begins to unify the Turks. And he creates this new empire. So in 1302, you have the Battle of Bethlehem, where these guys defeat a Byzantine army in Asia Minor. And then by 1326, they capture Bursa, or Prusa, which becomes the capital of the Ottomans, at least temporarily. Okay, and it's around that time that Osman takes on the title of Sultan, or authority, or ruler. Okay, and right there you can see the tomb of Osman. Okay, now, Ottomans begin to expand. It's going to be a long expansion. This is a very, very powerful empire. Orman I is going to rule not as Sultan, but as Emir. He succeeds his father Osman and he rules with a different title, but he ultimately consolidates power in Asia, which sparks in 1345 the Roman Emperor John VI requesting, doesn't spark that, but he requests Turkish age dealing with a dynastic struggle in Rome, this is kind of the setup for where the Ottomans start to really take some control in Roman territory even more. Anyways, in 1346, the Orhan is legitimized by end up marrying the Byzantine princess Theodora Maria Cantacuzene. Okay, this is the daughter of John VI. 1354, you have the destruction of Gallipoli, which was the Roman stronghold in Byzantine Thrace. So Gallipoli was a stronghold on the Byzantine region of Thrace. So with the earthquake devastating the city, it becomes very vulnerable. The Ottomans actually move across and get a foothold in Europe for the very first time. Okay. Now, the next guy is Murad. Murad, 1362 to 1389, succeeds his father. He's going to go back to taking the title Sultan. Okay, so he's going to rule as Sultan, not just as Emir. Now, the thing that he takes is Adrianople, 1361, and that's going to become the capital of the Ottomans until 1453. All right, so it's going to be a really significant moment. Effectively, this cuts Constantinople off from the rest of Europe, right? It's just the city itself, and the empire is effectively a city with a few little holdings elsewhere. But in 1361, the other big institution, or at least around this time, is the beginning of what are known as the Janissary Corps. The Janissary is going to be these new elite Ottoman soldiers that are drawn from originally prisoners of war, but later through what's known as the Devshirme, which is a children's tax. And what this body was a group of slave warriors. What they would do is they would take captured Christian children. They were forced to convert to Islam, but then they'd be raised and trained as warriors. They become, like I said, the elite forces that are going to drive the rest of Ottoman expansion. These are like the best of the troops. These are like the Spartans for the ancient Ottomans. Okay. Anyway, so we'll talk about the Janissaries again a little bit. Anyways, there were new crusades that were called. You have new invasions of the Mongols. For instance, Bayezid I, who actually launches a siege against Constantinople between 1394 and 1401, which ultimately sparks another crusade. In 1394, you have the Crusade of Nicopolis, which is the last large crusade. Ultimately, it's going to be a complete failure, but that takes place around this time. Basically because Bayezid was bragging that he was going to move on to even conquer France and Rome. So the Roman Emperor Manuel II and the King of Hungary, Sigismund, actually request this new crusade, and the Pope kind of responds. Actually, the popes, I should say plural, because at the time there was a pope in Rome and there was also a pope in France at Avignon. Both of these guys call it crusades. You've got the 10,000 volunteer army that's put together, but ultimately, like I said, it fails. This is nothing really significant happens here, but at least it stops the advance of the Ottomans into Europe at the time. But it's not due to the crusade. It's actually due to an invasion by Tamerlane from the other direction. He's a Turco-Mongolian warlord from Afghanistan. He was a Ghazi. And he founds what's known as the Timurid dynasty. And he was absolutely undefeated. This is one of the most impressive warlords in all military history. He actually conquers all kinds of territories from Russia and Persia and Anatolia. But he conquers Bayezid in 1402, defeats him, and then takes him prisoner. He captures Ankara, and then he holds Bayezid as his prisoner in a cage until his death in 1403 for another year. Anyways, what Tamerlane does is he inadvertently seems to have actually saved Europe from the Ottomans, at least at this early date. It weakens the Ottoman Empire. Bayezid His sons ultimately fight a civil war over the throne, but Constantinople, right, and the siege that was brought against them ultimately is lifted. So, there's the savior, at least temporarily, for the Roman Empire and for Europe. There's a picture of Abbasid in his cage and the Tamerlane visiting him in that particular slide, in that photo. But again, it's not long before the end of an empire, and that would be not the Ottoman but the Roman Empire. Mehmet II, Mehmet the Conqueror, 1451 to 1481. He actually takes the title early on, before he actually takes out Constantinople. He takes the title of Caliph of Islam and Caesar of Rome in 1444. 1453, we've already dealt with this. This is the fall of the Byzantine Empire. He launches the siege in April. He takes the siege, completes the siege by May. Constantine XI, Paleologus, the last emperor, he actually rode again to Rome, gets some help. The only troops he gets from Europe are from Venice and Genoa. Rome was not able to send forces to help out against the Turks because you got Black Plague, you've got in England and France the 100-Year War going on, you got the Reconquista occupying Spanish warriors, you get the Papal Schism still going on. So there's a lot of problems in Europe. There's really nothing that could help, and of course this is the end of the Romans. But even though his famous conquest of Constantinople took place, his most famous enemy happened to be a guy that you guys should know of by the name of Dracula. So let me just mention him briefly just because he's famous, not because this is a significant moment historically, but Vlad III Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler, as he's also known. This guy that was actually raised at the Ottoman court. Him and his brother Radu were raised as hostages of the Ottomans. His father was kind of a leader in Wallachia, which is now part of Romania. In 1462, Mehmet II invaded Wallachia, or Wallachia, however it's pronounced. And Vlad is actually forced to abdicate his throne or move from his throne. He's driven off by the Turks. But Vlad launches this really interesting surprise attack on the Sultan's camps, apparently killing like 20,000 of the Turkish soldiers, and then impales them on spikes, forming this big forest of the impaled, which ultimately, when Mehmet sees this atrocity, turns back and leaves the territory. But only temporarily, because he eventually returns, and Vlad, even though he had reclaimed his throne, is ultimately captured and killed. And Mehmet II supposedly preserved his head in a jar of honey to put on display after. But that's the story of Dracula, who's viewed by the Romanians as a great national hero. He's kind of a crusade type leader, one who defends the Christian world against the Islamic world, even though his more famous for the stories told about him from Bram Stoker on. Anyways, there are limits to the empire. Those are soon approaching. With Selim I, you have the Syria and Egypt conquered by the Mamluks. They lose those territories. Temporarily held Jerusalem, but ultimately the Ottomans at this time are going to assume the caliphate, right? 1570 to 1524, they assume this. They bring the caliph, Abbasid caliph from Cairo, al-Mutawakkil III, to Constantinople, and then they transfer the symbols of his authority to Selim I. So Selim becomes effectively the caliph. So this is the Ottoman holding of that office. Suleiman the Magnificent, who is his successor, ends up taking Rhodes, 1522, which may be viewed as the end of the Crusades altogether, because this is the last group of Crusader knights, the Knights of St. John, the Hospitallers. This is one of the last Crusade strongholds. They take Rhodes in that year. And then in 1529, they have a siege of Vienna. This is a very important moment. This is a massive, massive army, probably 100,000 troops brought against Vienna. Due to poor weather, basically snow and ice, you've got a lot of problems. And even though you have some victories, ultimately they withdraw, and they never finish conquering the territory, what at the time was the Holy Roman Empire. Mehmet IV, jumping further ahead now, 1642 to 1693, is where the empire reaches its peak and also begins its decline. 1645 to 69 is the siege of Crete, the island in the Aegean. This is the longest siege in history. If you think about a siege lasting over 20 years, this is the one. Ultimately, Crete is taken. They also make one more advance on the city of Vienna in 1683. It's called the Second Siege of Vienna, or the Battle of Vienna. Mustafa Pasha leads an army of, again, over 100,000 men against Vienna. And Vienna was absolutely unprepared. There were only maybe 10,000 or so Habsburgs in control of the city, not enough to really stop an army that size. But the salvation comes for Vienna in September 11th by Jan III Sobieski, the Polish king, who brings 80,000 troops to the rescue at the last moment. And September 12th, the battle actually breaks the Turkish lines and ends effectively the expansion. And the picture that you see at the back of the screen is a painting that's in the Vatican Museum currently of Jan III sending the letter of his victory to the Pope after the Battle of Vienna. Anyways, there are also some treaties and loss of territory around this time as well. Some of the territory was given over along the Danube back to the Holy Roman Empire and Hungary and stuff like that. But the end of the empire is actually going to really start up with the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. So the 18th century, there is a decline in Ottoman power. The empire has grown weak. You can think of it as the East being left behind by the advances going on in Europe, right? You've got the Industrial Revolution going on in Europe. European armies are being revised, new technologies coming to play, and the conservative Ottomans and the Janissaries opposed a lot of the new military techniques and technology. Right? They were behind the times, and they're not going to be able to compete very long with the new rising European powers. In the 20th century, 1924, by that time they're known as the sick man of Europe. Right? They're there, but they're weak. And they make the big mistake of allying with Germany in World War I, and they join in World War I, and they perform very poorly in World War I. By 1918, the Ottomans ultimately defeated, the war essentially over. The Allies, British, Italian, French, Greek forces, occupy Anatolia, and it sparked kind of a national movement. A Turkish War of Independence starts up, but they begin to partition the old Ottoman Empire. They divide it up into various territories. In 1922, Mehmet VI is the last sultan, steps down. He's also the second to the last caliph, but he's the last sultan. The National Assembly in Turkey basically abolishes the sultanate at that time, and he goes into exile. The caliphate is passed on to his cousin, the guy that we talked about before, Abdülmecid II. He becomes the last caliph, 1622. But in 1923, Mustafa Kemal, also known as Ataturk, he's the most important modern historical figure in Turkish history, dissolves the Ottoman Empire, and he establishes the Republic of Turkey, becoming its first president, and then within a year ultimately dissolves the caliphate. He abolishes that religious office. Right, 6 months after the Republic begins, the Caliphate is ended, and that's why Abdülmecid goes into exile in 1924 into Europe. Right, so it's the end of the Ottoman dynasty. It's the end of the Ottoman Caliphate. It's the end of the Caliphate period. And like I said, Abdülmecid dies, kind of at the end of World War II in Paris. So it's a long history of Islam, but it's a very important history, and it's a history that's very often not covered in most high school history courses. So you've got a lot of cultural importance, and what we're going to cover next time is really looking back at some of the distinctions between Sunni Shia, and hopefully a little bit on the practices within Islam, particularly the 5 pillars. So for now, I think that's good as a historical overview. So hopefully you got something good about, useful out of that.